And the act of moving onward means we pass these signposts. One of them was first leaving Earth. The next one is hanging out on the moon. What's next? The planets. Onward to the edge. We're moving onward to the edge. Here we are together. This fragile little world. This fragile little world. Onward to the edge. We're moving onward to the edge. Here we are together. This fragile little world.
Hey folks, welcome to Voices from L5, the podcast that explores the other side of space settlement. With me today is David Valentine, Professor of Anthropology at the University of Minnesota. Who'll be talking to us today about society, space, and, well, what else, David?
Hi, Liam. My research has been focusing on the space settlement movement and the attendant commercial space enterprises. The new space enterprises. But my real interest is in how the move to space, or even the proposal of the proposal that we do move humans to space, really challenges our idea of what the human is, of what the world is, of what the universe is. So I'm interested in what kinds of perspectives on the idea of the world or the idea of the human might emerge in a context where there are people on Mars in free space colonies living on the moon, even perhaps on the moons of the outer planets. What might happen when Earth is no longer everything that we can imagine as the world? So I think this is a real challenge to us as people, as thinkers, as citizens, and it's certainly the case that it is a challenge to anthropology to imagine Earth not as the ground of everything that we know, but just as one place, certainly a privileged place because this is where we come from, but as one place where humans could be. I find that a very intriguing question.
I would agree with you, and it's interesting to hear you talk about this from not only necessarily this perspective that some people might expect you to be talking about what society might be in the future, but also speaking about how our current society is being changed by these ideas and these proposals and the way that we're going about talking about the future.
Yeah, I'm naturally not all that interested in trying to predict. That actually is what I'm interested in hearing about from people that I work with. I'm more interested in what that can tell us about how it is we conceive of what it is to be human in the first place. Given the vast differences that characterize our species, and given the complexity of the systems upon which we depend to live on our planet, what kinds of how people explain and describe the worlds that they imagine in space, whether again on Mars or in a free space colony or whatever, is really interesting, because what that does is it requires people to propose what a world is. It requires people to list everything from gravity and microbiomes to, division of labor and religion and recreation and haircuts, right? You have to account for all of it, and you have to account for the interplay between and among all of those different elements. You have to think about history. You have to think about race. You have to think about gender. You have to think about all of these. You have to think about social class, about work. All of these components, which are for us emergent properties of our history on this planet, but which have to be accounted for and built into a system from the beginning in a space settlement. So it's really the creation of a world that I find is the most intellectually interesting and politically interesting, actually, question about that arises in talking to people about space settlement.
Do you find that how people talk about space settlement and how people talk about these worlds that they construct in their narratives. Do you find that reflects on the person themselves and perhaps some of their earthbound beliefs and political leanings and such?
Yes, of course. How can it not? And one of the I'm surprised by the diversity. Well, not surprised, actually. I'm not surprised by the diversity of visions of what these of what future space settlements might be. The one unifying feature, I would say, I have regular, ordinary conversations with people at many space conferences that I go to, or out in Mojave where I do field work as well. And I also do formal interviews. I've done, I think, about 60 so far. And in all of those conversations, when it comes to speculating about what the future will be like, people bring their very varied perspectives on what it will be like. But everybody says that we will be surprised. And I think that willingness and that openness to surprise is something that really characterizes this community. In fact, I often say that space settlement advocates are actually really excellent anthropologists up to a point, because they do have to denaturalize everything that on Earth we consider to be natural, right? So you have to actually think about gravity as a presence, as opposed to just being there as nature, as something which is kind of universal. You have to think about air. You've got to think about ecological cycles, again, as much as haircuts, right? So there's but nonetheless, the willingness that people have to be open to possibility and surprise, I find also quite compelling, and I hadn't expected that.
Yeah, I've always found that the space settlement community has at times frustrated me, but also at times, a lot of the time, I wouldn't really be a space settlement advocate if it does sort of fill me with the same feelings that you're talking about, where this openness to surprise and interesting ideas and this willingness to accept that we perhaps don't know exactly how things are going to pan out. Mm-hmm. Or if they will, indeed. One vision of the future that I have seen becoming more and more popular recently is the idea of corporate investment in space leading to a future where humans are settling space. And my own sort of casual look on this is that it's sort of syncing up with the new space movement, where we're looking at places like SpaceX and Elon Musk and the like, sort of leading the way now that NASA is perhaps taking a bit of a step back in the public eye. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that idea that the way how we're viewing space now is being changed by these corporate influences on it, and that's influencing our view of how we want space settlement to look like?
Well, I actually just reread O'Neill's High Frontier this past week for a paper I'm writing, and which is a really, if your listeners haven't read it in a while, because I'm sure most of them have, you should go back and reread it. It's a really fascinating book, and from the beginning, O'Neill is often or sometimes represented as a kind of having a commitment to big government, a big government involvement, state-led involvement in building these space settlements, his space settlements. And I think given where he was in the 70s, that makes perfect sense. But it's also clear that right from the beginning, he's very clear that these have to be economically viable entities. For them to succeed. And in fact, it's precisely the ability in his vision for space communities to build solar power satellites to beam power to Earth that provides that economic viability. Mm-hmm. So that notion of economic viability is not new, I think. The difference, of course, is that the actors are different. There are corporate actors, as you point out, who have certainly the most public plans for doing these kinds of things. I think for some people it is worrying that those are the primary actors. I would say, though, one of the places I found that there is very little willingness to be open to the possibility of transformation or change in space is in the question of exchange relations. In other words, how it is that economy works. And people are very explicit that commercial means is really the only way to go to space, and that space has to be profitable, and space colonies need to be economically viable. It strikes me, though, that the concern about corporate actors as the key engines of potential future space colonies ignores the possibility that exchange relations may change in space as well. In other words, I'm not convinced that any of the economic systems that we have on Earth will work in space precisely for the same reason that space settlement proponents are willing to be surprised or expect to be surprised. That sure. The economic systems that are developed on Earth have developed because it's been on Earth, right? Clearly people have needs and people will exchange. This is a fundamental part of what we do as humans. We exchange. We're engaged in an exchange right now, a linguistic exchange. People exchange words, they exchange ideas, they exchange goods, they exchange tokens of value, money, that kind of thing. But the way in which that happens, how value will be organized and understood in the different kinds of nature and the multiple kinds of nature of space, where distances are much longer, where things are not in relationship to one another in any permanent or fixed way as they are on the surface of Earth, that's an open question for me. So this is perhaps I think you asked me early on, something about things that people don't see or are blind to, or this may have been another conversation we had. But this, I think, is one of the blind spots in space settlement proponents' perspectives. That this is one of the earthbound assumptions that they are still carrying. And I'm glad that most people are willing to be surprised, because I would not be surprised if economic exchanges or economic exchange or economic relations didn't also have to change with the different natures of space.
And I mean, I think that in some corners of this culture you're seeing some backlash to that idea too. I mean, fairly recently there was some discussion about how the numbers put forward in O'Neill's book for economic viability don't really add up. And, more recently I've seen an article or a handful of articles even discussing how the introduction of asteroid material to Earth would be either completely unviable or crash the markets on Earth entirely. And, further, you've got, even if you want to take this into the future and get, very futuristic thinking, if you're talking about these space settlements building solar panels as part of their economic viability, you run into the issue that the economy on Earth would have to change massively, because all of a sudden there's access to all of this massive amount of power that no longer requires the massive amount of, economic infrastructure that something like oil or even nuclear and other renewables on Earth require at that point.
Sure.
I mean, I think that the change that you're talking about would sort of be inevitable, and it's interesting that both you and I have seen this sort of this reliance on current Earth capitalism and economics to push space settlement.
Yeah. I think whenever I bring up this challenge, well, not whenever, but often when I bring up this challenge, people's immediate response is, well, socialism isn't going to work in space. And I agree. Socialism is also an earthly system, right? There are certain kinds of values which underpin different economic systems, whether it's what we call capitalism or what we call socialism, or other forms of exchange, gift economies or economies based on reciprocity of labor, whatever it might be, that doesn't. These don't do away with the fundamental question of exchange, which is, again, as social beings, what we do. But it opens the possibility that the way in which economy and wealth and prosperity, commodities, forms of exchange, tokens of exchange, and so on, may transform quite radically. Yeah. And, if, again, this is all, putative and speculative and so on, but they're good thought experiments. And this thought experiment is simply this. If everything will change in space, because space is an entirely different nature from Earth, why should not exchange relations too? Right. As I said, I'm not in the business of prediction, but I am in the business of opening up what assumptions are. A business that I think I share with many space settlement proponents, which is why I feel very much at home in this community in this way. But this is, I'm always intrigued by the resistance to the idea that something called capitalism or free enterprise in its earthly form will somehow endure in space while everything else changes.
I think it's very easy for some members of this culture to look at free enterprise and free market capitalism as something that will endure into space because it's something that they see as one of the ways that will open the doors to space settlement in the first place. But it would be interesting to see what another culture that isn't quite so sold on the idea of free market capitalism. It would be interesting to see what their space settlement ideas are, how they think exchange would work in space, and if it is, I imagine it's just as married to whatever their terrestrial exchange method of choice happens to be.
Sure. I mean, I don't really know very much about the Chinese space program or their plans for,
a space settlement.
A space settlement is, thank you. But this is there's clearly a fairly statist, authoritarian mode of thinking, I suppose. But I guess my point here is really that they will probably be surprised as well. Sure. But depending, of course, on what the goal of the space settlement is, right? So, the space settlement movement is very much, doesn't want the, what probably a Chinese government, space station on the moon would look like, which would be, government astronauts or taikonauts, I suppose, from the Chinese perspective. That's not what they want. And I would agree, I wouldn't really want, just that either. Right. But again, the possibility of thinking through space, which is really what I'm doing in my project, thinking humanness through space, is the possibility of opening all taken for granted from the biophysical and the geochemical to the linguistic and the economic, to open naturalizing assumptions on all of those fronts.
Well, we've talked a little bit about the economic and a little bit about the political assumptions that have been made, but I also think that we had a little bit of a chat earlier about resources and how we take some of those for granted and how our view of those will have to change or may have to change in the future. And in particular, you used this phrase of an oxygen economy and a gravity economy at one point, which I thought was very interesting. This idea that something that we take for as granted as air or, the fact that down is down, the fact that we take that so for granted and that in a space settlement that wouldn't necessarily be true, and what effects that could have on a society, I find it very interesting. There's not really anywhere on Earth that we can point to as something that we can, look at and see those two in particular as being quite as limited or as not taken for granted as they would be in space.
Well, with air, actually you can. I think gravity is of a different order. Oxygen or air, you just need to think about pollution, right?
Oh, that's true.
And the differential residence patterns in somewhere like, for example, Hong Kong, where the anthropologist called Timothy Choi has written about this in his book, the name of which I cannot remember right now. But Choi, Choy, if anyone's interested. And he talks about how it is in Hong Kong that people who live lower down on the slopes of the mountain live in actually very heavily polluted atmosphere, while people who can afford to live higher up on the slopes where the air is clearer, guess what, tend to be richer, right? So there's plenty of evidence of stratification of natural resources on Earth, and in fact we have a lot of battles about that, right? Water rights, land rights, the right to clean air, to clean drinking water, and so on. What's interesting about gravity is that without exception, we're all subject to, 1G. It's not financializable. It's not, you can't financialize it, monetize it. You can't differentiate it. You can't prohibit someone or force someone to have gravity. Gravity is just there.
Without a great cost to you,
with none,
you couldn't possibly change that for someone.
Right. Exactly. And you can augment gravity by putting someone in a centrifuge, but it's not possible to take away, except by going to space. So that raises very interesting questions, given that, as we all know, there's virtually no research done on either human or non-human biology between microgravity and 1G. Right, there's nothing in between. All the attempts to do centrifuge research in space have come to naught. Although I think actually I heard that there's a rat centrifuge going to the ISS relatively soon. It may actually even be there now. But anyway, very little data. But we have the suspicion, knowing that as we do, that there's all kinds of negative consequences to microgravity, to the human body, that some gravity is necessary at least, right?
Right.
So, whether we don't know whether human bodies will, be able to live long, healthy lives, or if fetuses will be able to come to full term in Martian gravity, for example. We just have no idea.
Right.
So we're faced with the possibility, therefore, that we will have to produce gravity, and we imagine that we can do that through some form of, very large centrifuge, effectively, O'Neill's Island 3 or something like that. Of course, we have no idea whether the mimicry of gravity through centrifugal force will work either. But anyway, let's say that it does. You face the question then of what gravity becomes for you. Is it something that can actually become part of an economy? Is it something, this is again why thinking through space raises all kinds of interesting questions about humanness. How will that be taken on as part of the world? Will it be considered part of nature? Because once you start your Island 3 spinning, it keeps spinning, right? It's not impeded. It just keeps on spinning. You don't really need energy to keep it going.
Right.
Or even if you do, you've got plenty of solar power to do it. But is it understood as part of nature? Is it understood as part of, could it become monetized? Like, for example, water has become privatized and monetized, on Earth. Would you have to pay gravity tax or a gravity fee? What would happen if you didn't pay your gravity fee? Or would we consider gravity a human right? There's definitely moves to make, to argue for water, access to clean drinking water as a human right, on Earth, which is, being heavily resisted by those people who make money out of water.
Right.
Or, would gravity be something would there be gravity tourism? Would you be forced to have gravity, which is another question, right? If you were too long in zero gravity, could some form of government force you to take gravity as a medicine. Like people are required, mandated to have health insurance now under the ACA. So there are all kinds of very interesting questions when something so fundamental to what we know as nature becomes something that we have to produce and have policy about.
Right. And I mean, that extends to not just from something so fundamental as gravity, but then you can extrapolate that out into nature, into, trees and grass and fields and that sort of thing. That
yes, indeed.
Even right now, people who live in built-up cities, we talk a lot about how not having access to that sort of greenery has pretty strong effects on people. And, if we're talking about Island 3 sort of scale settlements, then you also have things like, weather and how people will be able to affect that and how that can change how we look at weather, which is right now on Earth a fairly uncontrollable beast. Sure. That sort of changes from where you live, but is still fundamentally something that you can't really do a lot about. But on Island 3, you may very well have the ability to change, cloud formation and temperatures and that sort of thing.
And actually, this raises perhaps the most fundamental question that's raised by the space settlement movement, which is whether a move to space will transform our notion of what, when I say our would include humans living anywhere in the cosmos.
Sure.
Our concept of nature, or if it is, you have to make gravity and you can control weather, and you can build mountains at the end of a cylindrical colony like Island 3. What is nature after all, right? And so this key distinction, which is fundamental to post-Enlightenment. Well, actually, even before that, but certainly, in Western society, between nature and culture is also one that is fundamentally challenged by the move to space, where, humans have to become conscious of the nature that they assumed as just natural in order to survive. That poses really fundamental questions to this key binary which underpins Western society, and I find that fascinating.
There's a very famous quote by, it could be David Attenborough, it could be someone else, that says something along the lines of, man is not a part of the landscape, but instead shapes the landscape around him. And you could consider these ideas of space settlement sort of the furthest extent of that sentiment.
Sure, and in fact, the fact that is something worth quoting indicates the extent to which what we call nature absorbs our activities and our excesses around it and its resources, right?
Right.
Which again, of course, will be thrown into relief in fundamental ways in a space settlement. And I realize as we talk space settlements, we really are talking in O'Neillian terms here.
Right. Yeah, there are other visions and ideas of space settlement, such as Mars colonies and moon bases and that sort of thing. Yeah. But primarily, we're talking about O'Neill's visions.
Yeah, and I think I find those the most interesting to think about, frankly, because everything does have to be produced.
Right, and it's also so much different from Earth. I mean, on the Moon and Mars, they are very alien, strange worlds, but you still have gravity. You've still got not terra firma, but whatever you want to use to refer to ground beneath your feet. And to a certain extent, you've got atmosphere and dirt. I mean, we have relatable aspects there, but I think the reason that it interests me and you and I think so many other people, why it caught so many other people, O'Neill's visions for it, is because it's so strange and different, and so a society of evolving in those spaces would be so radically different from Earth itself.
Right. Yeah. And even I've actually been writing about this recently, thinking about there's a space architect whose name is Theodore Hall, who has published quite a few papers, some of which are in the proceedings of some of the SSI, the Space Studies Institute, space manufacturing proceedings from the 70s and 80s, who talks about how gravity on a rotating space station isn't different only because it's provided by motion as opposed to the mass of a planetary body, but it's also different experientially, which requires a different attitude toward architectural design. So he makes the point that on Earth there are three gravitational directions: up, down, and horizontal. Right. So you walk when you walk horizontally in whatever direction, gravity is the same. In a space station or a rotating O'Neillian cylinder, you have at least 6 gravitational directions, right? Up, down from your standing position, axial along the axis, and then retrograde and prograde, walking with and I imagine sort of at different angles between the axial direction and what we might call east or west, by analogy with Earth.
Right.
So that's 6 different kinds of gravitational embodied gravitational experience, which is it's really hard to conceive of, actually, to what that might mean. And for Hall, I love his stuff because it's this very inventive imagination of how you would design a staircase, for example.
Right.
Designing a staircase that goes up and down in the same direction as the rotation of the cylinder would be different from a staircase that you would build that goes in the other direction.
Right.
Because the body would be either going with the rotation of the cylinder or against it. And his point is, even in a cylinder as large as Island 3, you would experience, that would be experientially different. And so this then raises questions about everything from exercise regimes and the amount of time you leave to walk to a particular place, to poetry and language and metaphor and idiom.
I mean, one of the biggest metaphors we have on Earth is, or perhaps not metaphors, but stories, is the idea of gravity being discovered by watching an apple fall from a tree. But on Island 3, that apple would have fallen in a dramatically different way than it does on Earth.
Sure. Yeah. Yes, exactly. And yeah, I just ran out of things to say. Sorry.
That's fine. We're back to the presumptions side of this that we were talking about. I mean, when we drop an item on Earth, we expect it to fall down. But if you dropped an item on a cylindrical station, it would go, slightly away from you at the same time as falling down. And I think that it's interesting. Astronauts that have been on the ISS for a long time, I've read, have issues adjusting from zero gravity, where they will, occasionally drop a pen because they expect it just to be floating around while they go off and do something else. Or, there was a video done recently. It was sort of a parody, like it was a joke, but basically there's this astronaut's giving an interview and just immediately drops a glass of water because in space you would expect your mug, if you like, just to be hovering around next to you as you gestate with your hands and make motions. But it's interesting that you bring up sort of art and poetry, because one of the things that you said you studied and talk about a lot is linguistics and stories. And one thing that's always been interesting to me is what the change in art and in the change in space produced artwork would be. Artwork on Earth is so intrinsically tied to the cultures and places that we come from, and in these presumptions, these parts of our life that we can't really change or affect. Stories and poetry about forests and fields and majestic mountains and rivers, and it would be interesting to see how people living in space discuss and talk about, their culture in that way.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I think, to me, the most interesting art form if I had a chance to observe any art form that emerged out of a space society, it would be science fiction.
Yeah.
Because I think we have remarkable science fiction written for us that imagines all kinds of worlds and imagines all kinds of different alien life forms and different kinds of nature and different encounters between different kinds of species and humans and natures and so on. But it's all written on Earth and from the perspective of Earth, right? And so at a fundamental level, it's a very earthly genre. And I'm very curious as to what science fiction written from a a cylindrical space colony would read like, right? What are the again, where you're living with you're living in a nature where gravity is relevant in at least six different directions, right? What does that do to your own embodied experience that is reflected in the art that you produce in the form of science fiction? And of course, this would go for this would run the gamut of all the different art forms, but also I would add, to the extent that we should recognize that art is an integral part of creativity, is an integral part of daily life, of every conversation, how it would also impact the idioms, not just words. I mean, clearly, probably you'd need new words for things that you have in your space settlement that aren't available, that we would never have on Earth, but kinds of idioms, like for example, on again an O'Neillian cylinder, up and down, or the notion of ground, or the notion of center and periphery, right? So in Earth, the center is something. The center of power is where things happen, right? That's the periphery is where recreation happens, or where other people live, or where colonial possessions were during the colonial period, right? They were at the edge of things. In a space cylinder, the periphery is where everything's happening. The center is where things are light and funny and where you can float free of gravity, right? Where recreation happens. So I think a lot of terrestrial metaphors and idioms also will come under stress, come under strain, they will be under advisement, shall we say.
At the risk of becoming purely an apple and tree stereotyped person, the apple would fall fairly far from the tree in an island tree.
That's a very good point.
Well, David, you've been a fantastic guest. This has been a very interesting talk. I'm really looking forward to hearing some of the comments on this episode. And honestly, we've covered maybe 10% of what I'd love to talk to you about. I think both of us could sit here for hours and chit-chat, so maybe sometime in the future we could have you on again. Yeah, that would be fun. Maybe, once I'm actually writing my book and I actually have to think about organizing all these thoughts into actual chapters. That would be fantastic. Is there anything you'd like to plug or any shout-outs you'd like to give before we go? Shout-outs are always to the people, the many people who have contributed to my thinking and given selflessly of their time over the now 6 years that I've been doing this research, and with the hope that what I produce out of it will be of some value to them. That's a wonderful sentiment. Thank you again for your time. Thanks, Liam. Hope to have you on again. You too. Okay. Take care. Hey folks, thanks for listening to the show. If you have any comments, suggestions, or questions, please email me at voicesfroml5@gmail.com. Music for Voices from L5 has been graciously provided by John Boswell of Symphony of Science. Find more of his work at www.symphonyofscience.com. Hey, if you like what we do here and you want to hear more experts from all sorts of fields talking about space settlement in ways that you might not hear anywhere else, consider donating to our Patreon account. We really rely on donations to keep the show going, and even a small donation helps us get better guests, better equipment, and produce a better show for you. We have some great goals in mind for the show, and we'd really like you to make something special. You can check out a link to our Patreon account on the website. Thanks.